Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And this one I'm going to go over my ninth and final round game from the Luneberg Chess Festival. Now, if you followed the round 8 video, you know that I drew a game that I really should have probably lost. There were many moments where I was just completely losing, and I was quite fortunate to get a draw in the end. And it really kind of was emblematic of just my tournament play in general. I was not myself. I was making, big mistakes and little mistakes all over the place. And to be quite honest, I was quite eager to finish this one and end the tournament. I was actually quite glad when we have one game to go on the last day, and I know that there's life after this tournament, because sometimes you just get sucked into this one moment actually defining you, and it's important to kind of remember that, usually there are other opportunities down the road, and that no one tournament or game or moment should define you, good or bad, right? So it's just kind of important to remember that sometimes, and you actually do tend to remember that towards the end of a tournament. So I was eager for this one to be finished. Now, I didn't want to take the last round for granted. I believe earlier in the series, much earlier in the series, in February or March actually, of my 2019 games, I'd mentioned that the last round games had been an issue for me previously, because I maybe wasn't taking them as seriously if I wasn't in the tournament as, the first few rounds. But I'd since kind of moved away from that and was not essentially ignoring the importance of the last round games. Every game is FIDE rated, so you don't want to take any FIDE points for granted. And so I was still going to give it my best in this one. My opponent in this one was a young German player by the name of Jari Rueker, born in 2001 with a FIDE rating very close to 2400. I assumed he was going to be someone that gets the International Master title soon. It's kind of funny because he's actually a untitled player, which means that he never actually decided to get the FM title. And there's some players that actually decide to do this. They say, you know what, the FIDE Master title, I could care less about it. I'm going for the bigger ones, the IM or the GM, and they don't even waste time trying to pay the small fee that's required to actually get the title. I don't think the Federation actually covers your FM title fees. So it is what it is. There are some players like this. In fact, there used to be a really good chess trivia question about which players went straight from untitled to GM, because it used to be a time where there was only a few players that did that. Now I'm sure there are many players that have done that since. But yesteryear, like 20 years ago, that was a really great trivia question, and I believe the answer, or a few of the answers, were Vladimir Kramnik and Larry Christensen. I believe those are two players that were never IMs. They just went straight to GM. But anyways, without further ado, I was white, so let's get into it. I'm with D4, which is, as you may know, pretty typical for me. I'm, 95% of the time employing D4. And Knight f6 was played. Jari, I saw he played some Nimzos, so I was kind of trying to steer the game toward that end, and that's why I played c4 next. And after e6, I played Knight c3, and then he actually played Bishop b4, and lo and behold, we have this Nimzo that I was actually looking at the night before, so I was happy that at least I predicted the opening correctly. Now, the line that I'd been employing with some decent success and familiarity was actually Queen c2, and I actually decided to go for that in this game. The reason for it, I think, is it suits me quite nicely. Essentially, white is just set on getting the two bishops right away with the move a3 next, and ultimately he doesn't spoil his pawn structure. So essentially, for me, I care quite a bit about pawn structure. I really care about the two bishops, and so it's an opening that just fits my style quite well. So white essentially has the long-term trumps in the position. In the short term, black has a lead in development, and that needs to kind of be offset in the next 10 or so moves. So that's pretty much how the contours of the opening are set, is white has the long-term trumps, black has the short-term trumps. So after Queen c2, black actually castled. There are a few other moves in the position, I should say. So one is actually d5, one is actually c5, and then there's also Knight c6, which is a rare guest. But castles is also quite common, so not a huge surprise. And after castles, the point of Queen c2 is to go a3 right away, pretty much. So the point is that now the bishop has to make a decision. And if the bishop says, no, I don't want to take on c3, I want to go back to e7, Now the actual other purpose of queen c2 is actually supports the e4 break. So now white will be able to take the center with e4 and push forward with e5 and get a pretty decent advantage based upon all of the space in the center. So this would be kind of ill-advisable for blacks. That's why black takes on c3. The bishop takes c3 check. And then, of course, I play queen takes c3, preserving my pawn structure, not to have double pawns. And this is where, actually, the game took a little bit of a turn for me, because the main move in this position is actually b6. This is what most people do. They put the bishop on the long diagonal. They try to fight for the e4 square, which is really critical because white controls the other squares in the center. So e4 is the one that's really important for black to kind of get a hold on. And then typically with the bishop on the long diagonal, then they go d6 and knight bd7. And sometimes play for e5, sometimes play knight e4, sometimes play c5, even sometimes play f5. And in fact, a combination of those plans is what is ultimately normal. If you saw my game from the Marshall Championship, or no, not the Marshall Championship, excuse me, it was the New York International that took place at the Marshall Chess Club. I actually had a game against Yaroslav Zarabuk, Grandmaster Yaroslav Zarabuk, where he actually went for this knight e4, bishop b7, and f5 plan. And I was actually quite fortunate to draw that game because I didn't play very well. Well, that's kind of the type of setup I was expecting, especially because I got kind of outplayed in that game. But instead, after queen takes e3, Jari went for the very, very rare move, queen e8. And this is an extremely rare guest in this particular line. I mean, I think it's been played a few hundred times, but the classical Nimzo has been played, well, thousands and thousands, I dare say tens of thousands of times. And queen e8 is really a strange-looking move at first sight and one that I'd never seen before. But the idea I was able to kind of grasp relatively quickly because you see this queen e1 move with white sometimes in King's Indian attacks. And the only idea there is actually to help support a pawn push in the center. Because otherwise, you're basically just locking the rook on f8. So I believe the idea with queen e8 is to play d6, e5 quickly. Now, there could be a question about why it's important to put the queen on e8 to support the e5 break, because there could be a scenario where I would argue black could play d6, knight bd7, and e5 in that vein. But perhaps the point is that if I play knight f3 and knight bd7, you still actually aren't ready to play e5 because I have 3 pieces on it. But even here, I'd be a little bit perplexed because it seems to me that rook e8 would be the more natural move to support the e5 thrust. So queen 8 is a move, and he played it, but I was a little bit unclear, at least at this point, why this was better than rook e8. Now, I would figure out a little bit later why that was the case. I'm not going to tell you exactly why now, but why don't you think about it, and then you'll find out in essentially a few moves or so. So anyways, after queen c3, queen e8, I continued with my development with knight f3. I thought this made a lot of sense, just developing and also keeping an eye on that e5 square. And now black played a5, and this was a move that was quite unusual to me as well because it seemed not particularly consistent with the queen e8 plan. Like, essentially, if he's trying to play e5, why is he taking time out to play a5? Well, I think the reason a5 is the move that he made is because he's trying to limit my queenside expansion. One idea in this system is for me to play b4 and bishop b2. And in that particular scenario, the pawn on a5 would not really be able to go there because I'd probably just push b5. So let's say that a move like d6 was played. Now I can go b4, and if a5, b5, I think white is kind of happy with this transaction where the pawn gets advanced to b5. The a file is closed, so the rook on a8 doesn't get counterplay, doesn't get to trade rooks at all. And I think white has a little bit of an advantage here based upon the space. And again, once his bishop comes to b2, e5 is not supported. So essentially, I think the idea with a5 is to just take more space on the queen side so I don't get to totally max out with b4. So it makes some sense, but it is not consistent with queen e8. After a5, I played the move b3, which is, you might consider relatively modest, but the idea is I really wanted the bishop on this long diagonal, so I was going to insist on it even if it meant that my pawn was on b3 instead of b4. Now, one interesting question is given the fact that he did wind up playing a5, maybe I could have played b4 before knight f3 and gotten the more desirable setup. So, for instance, let's say b4 now. Now a5, I just go b5, and I don't see any huge difference between me putting my knight on f3 right away or delaying it a move. So an argument could be made that perhaps b4 right away is playable, but who knows? It's just another game. So after knight f3, a5, I went b3, and now black went d6, and you can see now he's coming back to his plan connected with the e5 break, which makes a lot of sense. I went bishop d2, so now that I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces on the e5 square, so at least discouraging it for quite some time. And now black went knight bd7, again supporting that break with another piece. And now I went e3, just developing. And the question here always with this type of setup is where to put the bishop, because the bishop can also be deployed as a fianchetto on the g2 square. But I think one of the things that I am kind of thinking about in this structure is that the black bishop, the remaining black bishop, the light square bishop, ultimately tends to go to b7. And I don't like the bishop basically hijacking the light square diagonal and the bishop on g2 kind of being limited, because I think white is actually not as pleased if an exchange of the light squared bishops takes place. Essentially, part of white's advantage is based upon the bishop pair, and so trading those bishops is not necessarily in white's plans, especially because it gives black increased control over the e4 square. So to me, it makes a little bit more sense to keep the bishop on another diagonal just so it's not opposing the light squared one. So that's why e3 is played. And after e3, black went b6, again trying to get that bishop to the long diagonal. So you can see we're both kind of like playing with our own plans. I think that white has kind of weathered the storm reasonably well. There hasn't been any major conflict in the center yet, which is great because white's just kind of trying to develop the pieces and then claim the long-term edge. And black really needs to get something going in the next few moves. So after b6, I went bishop e2, just developing the bishop modestly. And that's actually another interesting question, is whether to put the bishop on d3 or e2. There are pros and cons to both. You can argue that on d3 it's on a more active diagonal, but the reason that I don't find d3 to be as attractive is because when e5 actually does come, and there is a possibility it may come at some point, then e4 is actually a fork to the bishop and the knight on f3, and that's kind of a annoying nuance. And so a good reason why the bishop doesn't go here is because of that e5, e4 potential. The other point is that when e5 comes, let's say that if I exchanged on e5, then the knight coming to c5 would actually hit the bishop on d3 with tempo. So I actually think the bishop is just more vulnerable on d3. Last but not least, if black actually does play bishop b7 and knight e4, there are some lines where I actually want to challenge the knight or actually exchange it, but I don't want to exchange it for my bishop on d3. And so if black ever goes f5, it's actually nicer that my bishop is on e2 so that if I exchange, I don't lose a tempo with f takes e4. So all those little details told me that the bishop ought to be on e2. So after bishop e2, Jari went bishop b7, and now I castled, and I thought I had a fantastic position here. My rooks are connected. I'm kind of controlling the e5 break for now, and I just need to kind of get some control over the e4 square, and I thought I'd be in a great shape. So I thought the opening was a resounding success for white. But now Jari actually took very concrete actions in the center that I had to deal with, and the first move he made doing that was knight e4. This move is actually very thematic in the structure, and the point is that black's counterplay in many respects is based upon play on the e4 square. So essentially, he forces my queen back with this move. He makes e5 a little bit more of a possibility because now there are 1, 2, 3 defenders of the e5 square, and there are only 3 attackers, so he could technically even play e5 right away if he wanted. And this is kind of the source of the counterplay, is knight e4 connected with some e5 or even f5. Now, after queen e2, black actually played f5, And now we actually can finally see why the queen on e8 is actually played. Because basically, with the queen on d8, it can't really enter the fray on the king side because my knight is controlling these important dark squares. And on f6, it might be a little bit vulnerable to a d5 break. But by sidestepping to the light squares, the queen actually is a lot more secure entering via g6 or sometimes even h5. And I think that is actually the crux of the idea. So very, very interesting plan, putting the queen on e8, potentially shifting towards the king side, also controlling some light squares. Very interesting plan, but not one that I think is like gonna totally ruin White's position or anything. Just a unique and creative plan. I still think White is better here. Black is again playing with kind of a short-term initiative because my two bishops should be a factor later on in the game. Now, the other thing with f5, besides opening up the queen for potentially transfers to the king side, is also sometimes this rook transfer via f6. And this is actually something I was quite concerned about, with something like rook f6, rook g6, with a direct assault on the g2 square, or sometimes even the h2 pawn. I think either square sometimes allows black to enter with very, very decisive effect. So I have to be quite alert to kind of deal with that rook transfer. Now, there are a few ways to deal with this. One way is to kind of sit on black playing rook f6, and then they go d5. And whenever d5 is played, the bishop actually opens up on the diagonal and hits the rook on f6, and then also tries to break up White's pawn structure. And there are some scenarios where that happens, but a lot of times when rook f6 and d5 is played, black will actually play e5 and shut down the bishop's diagonal, but it's kind of a double-edged decision because then the bishop on b7 is also shut down. So I actually thought those types of positions should be favorable for White, but they're obviously quite complicated. Another way to kind of neutralize the black pressure, particularly on this diagonal, is by essentially trying to play for f3. So in some positions, White can go knight d2 or even knight e1 and actually play f3, challenge the knight on e4, and then if the knight backs up, with the pawn on f3, the bishop is actually blunted on this diagonal. So just to give you a hint of what that looks like, let's say rook d1, let me just say knight e1, just to illustrate. King h8, f3, knight f6, and then the knight can sometimes transfer to d3, and you can see here the bishop on the long diagonal is not as hot here. Although it's still, doing a job, and it's still something I have to be wary of. At least the bishop is not as strong. I've managed to push the knight back, and I get some control over the e4 square, which is a kind of a long-term strategic play for White. So those are pretty much the ideas in the position kind of to neutralize the black pressure, particularly on the king side. And I actually took a totally different course here because I wasn't, at the time, completely aware of those concepts, and instead decided to play b4. And the reason I played b4 is because I reasoned that if we trade a few pieces, the attack on the king side, the potential attack, is not as venomous. And I thought that that would be something that would be quite attractive. Because, again, though endgames are slightly better for me, I figured, with the bishop on this long diagonal. So I thought it would be kind of cool to trade a pair of rooks. And if the A file opened up now that my rooks are connected, I could recapture with the F1 rook and maybe even infiltrate via A7. So I thought this made a lot of sense. Black now played C5, though, kind of ignoring the threat against the A5 pawn. And I don't agree with C5, but I actually do agree with the principle of ignoring my idea to open up the file. Because if you go for a move like A takes B4, I do believe this is quite bad for black. Again, this rook is coming to A7, which is quite annoying in some structures. So the queen can't just run away towards the king side, because rook A7 is actually a really annoying move to face with my rook playing now on the 7th rank. So you don't really want to allow that. And if you actually think about it, B takes A5 isn't a major threat because the rook can take on A5 and kind of slow up any counterplay on the queen side. So I actually think it makes sense to kind of keep the tension there, not do anything with it. I don't agree with C5, though, because at the end of the day, now you're actually giving me the opportunity to open my bishop on this diagonal, which is actually something that white actually struggles to do for some time. Again, as I mentioned before, whenever white tries to play d5, black typically will consider playing e5 to lock down the bishop on this diagonal, and then it takes me some time to open it up again. I have to go like knight e1 and f3 and f4, and just to try and get that some scope. But all of a sudden, with the move c5, essentially, I'm getting the opportunity to either play b takes e5 or d takes e5 whenever I feel like, and these will open up files on the queen side and the center, with the d file potentially open and the b file potentially open, and the diagonal for my dark square bishop. So I think it's just ill-advised to actually help facilitate white's counterplay on that flank, when really black's play should be coming on the king side. So after c5, I had a decision to make about which file I wanted to open, how did I want to get it done, and I decided to play b takes c5. And the reason I did that is because I can still open up the diagonal, the h8 to a1 diagonal for my bishop whenever I want with a eventual d takes c5. But I like the fact that after b takes c5, the b file was going to be open, and my rook could come to b1 and challenge that bishop on b7, which is unprotected. So after b takes c5 was played, I actually played rook a b1, and now you can see here there might be some tactical ideas based upon that bishop on b7 being loose. And so I thought that white actually had a serious advantage here. After rook a b1, black now went for bishop c6, which makes some sense. Once you realize that the bishop on b7 is unprotected and that there's some tactical ideas based upon me releasing my bishop from b2, you decide not to keep it unprotected for too long, or at least to not keep it in the line of fire of a piece that potentially can attack it. So that made sense to me. And after bishop c6, I actually went for the move knight d2, now shifting gears towards playing with the other plan, which is to kind of control the e4 square, kind of neutralize the pressure of the light squared bishop on the long diagonal. And so I thought knight d2 was the best way to do that. Another way I could have done that is actually playing knight e1. And part of the reason knight e1 is actually attractive is because the knight has future squares from which it can navigate after the f3 move, which is not really the case with knight d2. Because with knight d2, my knight really doesn't have many squares that are attractive to go to. The f5 pawn is, of course, controlling e4. c4 is in the way of my knight getting there. And the knight on b3 just is voluntarily pinning itself to the queen. So there aren't so many future squares there that are attractive. Whereas with the knight on e1, you can see that d3 is actually quite a nice square, maybe even f4 later after that. So knight e1 actually would be slightly better than knight d2. After knight d2, I was trying to play f3, and now black actually went queen g6. And this is a move that is kind of dangerous, and I think is emblematic of the threats actually that black can manufacture on the white king. Because right now, all of a sudden, the queen is bearing down on g2, and the bishop is bearing down on d2, and this is kind of scary to deal with. Now, I can parry this, but I do have to be kind of alert in how I do that. And I thought I had calculated everything and worked it out, because I was a little bit like, oh man, queen g2 bishop g2 is going to be a serious idea. Knight takes d2 is a serious idea. I need to block that diagonal. So I went for the move f3. And here I thought, okay, this knight is going to take the one on d2. I'm going to play queen takes d2. And I'm just going to have the two bishops in a really nice position, because essentially now the bishop will be blunted on the diagonal. I can play d5 potentially and uncover my bishop and my rook. I can even play d takes c5 if I want and uncover my queen. I thought white has all the trumps here. But after the move f3, my opponent thought for a long time, thought for maybe like 30 minutes, and then played a move I, quite frankly, was not really expecting. I took a quick look at it before I played f3, but I did not take it seriously, and it was the move queen h6. Now, after this move was played, I really hunkered down and had to ask myself, did I miss something? Why is this a move? Why does it work? What's the concept? Can he really sacrifice a piece here? Well, the concept is that if I take on e4, he has queen takes e3 check. And all of a sudden, it seems like he's getting some pawns and some counterplay against my king. The question is, does this actually work? And does white have something to do against this idea? I'm going to allow you to pause the video and think about what the best move for white is in this position and whether this idea for black actually works. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out how white should proceed from here. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and kind of weigh the consequences of this line and what white should do in this position. Unfortunately, I took a step in the wrong direction, as was typical in this event, frankly. The best move in this position, and the move I simply did not calculate properly, is actually f takes e4 and picking up the challenge. Now, I was worried that after queen takes e3 check and king h1, that I basically would not be in a good place here after the move queen takes e2, because it seems now that essentially black has actually retained their piece. And I should say that before this, after queen takes e3, if rook f2 trying to protect the bishop, this would be terrible, because now f takes e4 threatens the rook on f2, and black is pretty is tying up white in a knot. So this would not be the way to go. But in this position, that was the question, is how to deal with this queen takes e3 check. I thought I had to go king h1. I thought after queen takes e2, I kind of stopped calculating here, because I said, oh, black has regained his piece. The material is actually equal. And actually, yes, the material equal. I have 6 pawns, and black has, no, excuse me, black has 7 pawns. So there is actually a pawn up in this scenario. And I was like, I don't want to go for this. But it actually turns out that I just stopped calculating here, and I should have continued here, because this is so forced. Because the position here is actually winning for white if I just find the next move, which is actually d5. And the point is that all of a sudden the bishop on c6 actually lacks squares, and there are tactical problems for the bishop if it goes back to b7. So for instance, if takes on d5 a few times and then bishop b7, now all of a sudden bishop takes g7 lands on the board, and all of a sudden white is just winning, because after king takes g7 and rook takes b7, there's a decisive pin on the d7 knight, and essentially white has pretty much regained his material right now. The material is equal, but the bigger issue for white, or the bigger issue for black, is that these pawns are split, and the king is weaker than the white king. And so, and the white actually has more space in the center. So all these factors actually add up to a decisive advantage for white. And yeah, that would actually have been a really winning line. Another thing is, if the bishop tries to deflect, let's say bishop a4, taking advantage of the fact that my knight is unprotected, if the queen moves, the problem for black is that the knight is also protected on underprotected on d7. So actually this type of line doesn't work either. And so essentially there's no way to cope with this d5 move effectively. And so the computer actually, instead of playing queen takes a2, argues for c takes d4, not recovering the piece and trying to keep some pressure on in the center. But now I can consolidate with rook e1, f takes e4, and bishop g4. And essentially I keep my piece, and these pawns look a little bit scary, but once the queen is forced to move, they will drop, and white's just completely winning here, being up a piece. So, yeah, unfortunately, I just did not calculate an additional move after the material was level again, and that was the difference, because white would be winning there. Instead, I played the move queen d3, trying to hug on to the e3 pawn with my queen and try to keep everything together and reinforce the threat of f takes e4. But here, my opponent had actually calculated this and had very quickly played the move c takes d4. And it was here that I actually realized that black actually had enough compensation here, and I probably was not going to win the game, because it dawned on me that now I can't actually take on e4 without there being a repetition. And if I take on d4, which would be desirable, my knight on d2 hangs. So for instance, I can't play e takes d4 because queen takes d2 is a problem. Or excuse me, knight takes d2 maybe. Actually, no, queen takes d2 is a little better. And I can't take with the bishop because then this knight comes to c5 with tempo, and now my queen doesn't even have any square on the third rank anymore. So I pretty much have to take this knight on e4. But the problem is that after f takes e4, now the very annoying knight c5 becomes a move. And all of a sudden here, black is able to force a repetition, because if I move my queen away from the third rank, if I move to c2, then queen takes e3 check is a problem, hitting that bishop on e2 again, and there's no tactics connected with d5 like in the previous lines. And so I pretty much have to go queen takes d4 to hold on to the e3 pawn. But now black has e5, and the only square I can go to now to hold on to the e3 pawn is queen c3. And note that b3 and d3 are both taken from me. And it seems for the moment that white should be winning, just having a piece up. But unfortunately, now there's knight a4. And this move actually forces the repetition, because essentially I have to keep an eye on the e3 pawn now. And after queen d3, there's just knight c5 and queen c3 and knight a4 and queen d3. And so after the move knight a4, he actually offered me a draw, which I accepted because I realized here that there was nothing more than a repetition, and that was just going to be the game. So we agreed to a relatively short draw here, being, I think it was about 20, I want to say it was 23 moves. So a relatively short game in terms of moves, but very, very dynamic. And yeah, I think I missed another opportunity. So yeah, that was just the way the tournament went. Lots of missed opportunities. So a bit disappointing not to win this one, particularly when I was winning for a moment. But also, I was glad not to lose the game, particularly with the shape I was in. And you know, on to the next. All right, so that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.